Thank you, Celia. And hello, everyone. My name is Alyssa. I am a veterinary officer in the EAD and epidemiology team here at PIRSA. And I will be giving you a high-level overview of avian influenza, the responses interstate, the difference between AI seen here and overseas, and what we would expect to see if an outbreak occurred here. Next slide, please, Chels. All right, avian influenza is a highly contagious viral disease of birds that can show a range of clinical signs. They are named based on the variant of the two types of proteins, hemagglutinin or neuraminidase, that they have on their surface. And these proteins are important in the virus's ability to infect and spread between animals. Next slide. They are further named based on their ability to cause disease in chickens, so either low or high pathogenicity avian influenza. So low path avian influenza, or LPAI, is common in wild birds, including Australian wild birds, and usually only causes mild or even no clinical signs in our wild birds or poultry. HPAI, on the other hand, is capable of causing disease in a range of severity, and also in wild birds and poultry. These types are only found in the subtypes of H5 and H7. And like all influenza viruses, they're constantly changing and evolving over time. And this can result in new versions of virus emerging and can even cause low path H5 or H7 to become high path. Next slide. So as we just said, LPAI is present in Australian wild birds, and the presence of the virus and which subtypes are appearing in our wild birds is monitored through national programs. Most of the samples that we collect are from wild bird feces at Bolivar wastewater treatment plant, where ducks and migrating shorebirds all aggregate together. We also collect samples directly from wild hunted ducks from the Coorong during the hunting season, and then we investigate significant unexplained sort of morbidity and mortality events in wild birds that are reported to us through members of the public, wildlife professionals, or you guys as vets as well. The other states do similar activities in their high-risk areas as well. To date, HPAI has not been found in Australian wild birds, which is where we differ from the rest of the world, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Next slide. So I'm sure you've all heard that there's been outbreaks interstate. So let's have a quick look at where and how these have happened. HPAI was detected in Victoria in May. A total of 8 farms were infected, 7 in Meredith in the larger declared area on the map to the right, and 1 in Terang in that circular area. These outbreaks were different subtypes. So one was H7N3 and the other was H7N9. Next slide. New South Wales has had 6 properties affected, all in the declared area at the top right-hand corner of this map. And again, this was a different subtype, so H7N8. Next slide. This one actually spread via a trace down to a property in ACT, and then went on to infect a domestic property as well, but it didn't go any further than those 2 sites. Next slide. They are now transitioning out of the immediate emergency response phase and are focusing on proof of freedom, which will take some time before the zones and associated restrictions can be completely lifted and Australia can regain our HPAI-free status. Next slide. So let's quickly talk about how we can end up with HPAI in our domestic birds like we have here. So with this image, where you see the blue line or virus, that's representing low path, and where you see the red line or little red virus, that's representing high path. So the LPAI virus, as we know, is circulating in our wild birds. A chicken may become infected with this low path avian influenza by direct or indirect contact with infected birds and their droppings. So this may be direct contact with wild birds, say, in a free ranging system, or by contact with infected droppings that have contaminated the ranging land, feed, or water. And in an indoor system, they may become infected through contaminated food, water, equipment, sort of all that being brought into the shed, or even on workers' clothing or boots. Once a chicken is infected with the low path, They may not show any signs of disease or potentially only show mild signs. However, the virus will replicate and spread among the flock. If this LPAI happened to be a H5 or H7 subtype, there is the possibility after passage within and between many individuals that it can mutate to become high path. This is more likely in sort of your larger flocks, so those that are long-lived, your breeders and your egg layers. So the birds will then start to show signs that become sick and rapidly spread this high pathogenicity form to the other birds in the flock. And then this can spread to other flocks or farms by movement of birds, eggs, humans, food, water, equipment, and vehicles. So many methods. This is the situation that's been seen previously in Australia and recently in interstate. And it is also what they used to see overseas. However, recently mutations have resulted in HPAI, high path, infecting, spreading amongst, and even killing wild birds as well. Next slide. Beautiful. So let's change direction and now look at what's happening overseas. So what we sort of just looked at is what the rest of the world calls the old or yesterday's HPAI. And luckily for us, we're still living in the past. However, since 2020, a new clade called HPAI H5N1 2344B has been circulating widely across the globe, behaving differently to previous AIs, displaying a significant increase in the intensity, frequency, and geographic range of the disease. So this map shows how it has spread across the Northern Hemisphere through Asia, Europe, the Middle East, down to Africa, across to North America, then rapidly it will be travelled down the western coastline of South America, then back up the eastern coastline. Then it moved to the subantarctic islands late last year and finally reaching the mainland of Antarctica early this year. And this leaves Australia as the only continent not infected. This new clade could theoretically make its way to Australia via long-distance flyways, by birds moving between Australia and Papua New Guinea, or now up from Antarctica via birds or even mammals. Next slide. As it has spread, it has caused extensive losses in poultry and has caused huge devastation in wild bird populations, killing thousands to tens of thousands or huge percentages of single species in certain regions. And this is just a little snapshot. So, for example, 40% of the Peruvian pelicans in Peru died in just a 3-week span. Next slide. Additionally, there's been a huge increase in mammals affected since this new clade evolved, particularly marine mammals and mammals that prey or scavenge on birds. But also unusual species such as alpacas, goats, and cattle, as is occurring in the US currently in their dairy herds. So the main concern with increased mammal spread is the ability for the virus to become mammal adapted or being able to sustain mammal to mammal transmission and therefore human to human transmission, which could potentially cause a new pandemic. Next slide. So a small number of human infections have been reported globally. Most of these people have had close contact with infected birds, cattle, or contaminated environments, especially during sort of your response activities. And most infections with this particular clade have been mild, including signs like conjunctivitis or mild respiratory type signs. This dashboard is just an example from the US CDC showing that despite us having over 100 million poultry across 48 states and many dairy herds across 14 states being affected, and sporadic cases and die-offs in wild and domestic birds and mammals, still there's only been 14 confirmed human cases in the US. Next slide. So let's jump back to that previous pathway and have a look at it with these changes. So whilst we still have the original pathway where the low path spills over to poultry, then converts and is spread onwards, overseas are also seeing this HPAI in wild birds, which can spill over directly from them to poultry. And this means that that conversion step is not required or it's been bypassed, and the poultry will start to show severe signs as soon as they're infected. And then you can also see that the HPAI in the wild birds is also spilling over into mammals, both wild and domestic species. Next, thanks. Beautiful. So what would we expect if it arrived here? Overseas, the first signs of the virus's arrival started as large die-offs in wild birds, mainly sea or shore birds, and those that mingle or breed in colonies. Then illness and death was seen in smaller properties with birds, usually like those backyard or rescue setups that had domestic birds and wild birds mixing together, followed by commercial premises having outbreaks, and then mammal infections sort of happen sporadically in between this as well. So if we jump to the next slide, this should give you a bit of an idea of how things unfolded in the US. So if we look back to December 21, HPAI was detected in hunter-harvest ducks, so asymptomatic, no signs. A month later, there was the first confirmed wild bird die-off from HPAI, this clade. And then a month later in Feb, when things really started to kick off, there were multiple confirmed wild bird die-offs, and infections in domestic and commercial poultry were also confirmed at that point. In March, March was retrospectively determined to be the first wild mammal cases, which was in a dolphin. And then in April, there were multiple red foxes affected. And the first confirmed domestic mammal case, which was a domestic cat, was in November, so a few months later. But this was actually, again, retrospectively identified, not until this year, with other possible sort of sporadic cases of mammals in between that as well, and domestic mammals as well. This then grumbled along, and we didn't sort of see this unusual scenario of the dairy cattle infection until March this year. So it was suspected that there was a spillover event from wild birds to cattle late last year, and then it wasn't seen until early this year. So while I suppose any animal may become infected, this is rare and it's not something that we expect to see initially. Next slide. And if we can get that video running. So what do we expect to see? And I suppose in our wild birds, we primarily expect to see neurological signs with quick decompensation and death. But we may just see mass die-offs without clinical signs being observed. We may also see gastrointestinal, respiratory signs, or even just typical sort of sick bird appearance and being able to catch them, which, you know, we don't expect these birds to be easily caught. In these videos, you can see the ataxia, flat lethargic, the twitching, inability to hold their head up, really not healthy birds. Okay, in our poultry, whether it's the old type or the new clade, they may just look like any sick chicken, but often it progresses quickly, affects many birds, and is rapidly fatal. So the infection can vary in its severity and may include respiratory signs, swollen head, cyanosis, neurological signs, or just, you know, your general sick bird. They may be reluctant to move, eat, drink, may have diarrhea, and if they are layers, they may stop laying or produce abnormal eggs as well. Next slide. In mammals, the signs are predominantly neurological with some respiratory signs, but this does vary between species as well. We would expect mammal deaths to coincide or sort of sporadically happen with those wild birds. And this may be sort of a few here and there, say foxes or domestic or feral cats, or maybe a die-off of, say, marine mammals like they saw in Southern America. And we don't expect to see it in production animals straight away. It was previously actually thought that cattle were really unlikely to become infected. And in the US, we are seeing atypical infections. So decreased milk production, thicker colostrum-like milk, reduced appetite, lethargy, fever, dehydration. And this is likely why it took so many months to sort of get that diagnosis, because it didn't look like flu in mammals. So with this in mind, and that we have unique fauna here found nowhere else, impacts are difficult to predict, but really anything is possible. Next slide. So in summary, Low path avian influenza is present in wild birds in South Australia, but they do not carry HPAI like wild birds in other countries. The new clade HPAI H52344B has not been detected in Australia, but could arrive here having health, welfare, economic impacts on poultry, wild birds, domestic and wild mammals, and even humans. Spillover of LPAI to poultry can occur anywhere in Australia, not just the eastern states, but it does require that evolution to HPAI to result in a disease outbreak. If H5N1 is to arrive here, we would expect to see it in wild birds, then captive birds, with sporadic cases in mammals and possibly humans as well.
Hello, my name's Alyssa. I'm a veterinary officer in the epidemiology and risk team here at PIRSA. The purpose of this recording is to provide you with an update on the Australian and global situation regarding avian influenza, and also to reiterate some key considerations that may affect you as veterinarians seeing wildlife and domestic pets. This is a dynamic space that is moving quickly, so it is important to note that the information I'm presenting today is relevant as of late March and is likely to change quite quickly. To start off, let's look at the current situation in Australia. During the webinar in October last year, 2024, we discussed the high pathogenicity avian influenza outbreaks in Victoria, New South Wales and ACT, which started in May and June of 2024. These outbreaks were successfully eradicated and Australia self-declared freedom from HPAI to the World Organization for Animal Health in early February of this year, 2025. So this did take quite some time, about 8 months from the start of the outbreaks to achieve national freedom. And unfortunately, less than a week later, a new unrelated outbreak was declared in Victoria. This outbreak was announced on the 8th of February, and up to now, it has been contained to 4 premises, all of which are under quarantine, and response activities to control and eradicate the virus are continuing. For those of you like me that are not so familiar with Victoria, this map gives you a better perspective of where the Victorian outbreaks have occurred geographically, with the 2024 outbreaks in the lower left of the map in the red colour, and the current outbreak in the top right-hand corner of the map in the yellow. Moving on to the global situation, we will start with our close neighbours, New Zealand. In December 2024, New Zealand had an outbreak of HPAI H7N6 on the South Island. Like in Australia, New Zealand's wild bird populations do carry LPAI. However, unlike here in Australia, where we've had sporadic spillover events where poultry become infected with the LPAI from wild birds, and then it mutates into HPAI and causes an outbreak, this has never happened in New Zealand before. This was their first occurrence of HPAI in the country. This is significant for us, I suppose, as our wider geographical region seems to be experiencing more spillover events and more frequent outbreaks. The Ministry for Primary Industries in New Zealand managed this response really well, despite it being the first of its kind, and the outbreak remained limited to only 1 premises. Moving on to the new version of HPAI, which we discussed in depth in the last webinar, we had mentioned that this virus progressed across the globe down to the subantarctic islands and even the Antarctic mainland. Now, over the last few months since our last webinar, mortality events have been reported on multiple subantarctic islands. The issue here is that confirmation of infection on these islands takes a long time to get, given their remote location and the difficulties associated with recognizing an outbreak, collecting and transporting those samples, and actually getting those test results back. The most recent confirmed case is on Kerguelen Island, shown by the orange marker to the far right, closest to Australia, right next to where it says December 2024. Now, the outbreak appeared to have started in December, but it did take a couple of months before we got confirmation, so that's only happened recently. Kerguelen Island is very close to the external Australian territories of Heard Island and McDonald Islands, which are located within the far left orange circle on the broad overview map, and also in that orange circle down to the left-hand corner on the zoomed in view. These islands have many species of significance, such as birds, including penguins, seals, and invertebrates as well. It has been widely accepted for some time now that the theoretical pathways by which the new clade could make its way into Australia is from the north. So via long-distance flyways, mainly the East Asian flyway, or by birds moving between Australia and Papua New Guinea. However, with these changes that we're seeing in the south, in that Antarctic region, there's now a third possible pathway, which is very close to us here in South Australia. This is via sort of bird movements along the Southern Ocean flyways, which loops around the Southern Pole, and then also via mammal movements through the Southern Indian and Pacific Oceans from different continents. As we discussed in the original webinar, this clade has caused morbidity and mortality in domestic and wild birds, many different mammal species, and even humans. If it were to arrive here in Australia, as vets, we need to keep in mind that any species can be infected and affected by this virus. There are certain species that we expect to see first. Mainly, obviously, wild birds, wild mammals closely associated with these birds, and this association could be either by habitat or by diet. Species that you may see outside of the obvious of the wild birds or the pet birds include scavengers or carnivorous mammals. So this could definitely include domestic pets, mainly cats, as they are more susceptible, but also dogs that have access to the outdoors, or maybe hunting and catching and even consuming small birds or other prey items that could be infected. Non-avian wildlife or feral species may also be brought into view, including foxes, cats, or even native quolls. As we discussed last time, signs in mammals can be quite broad, often with neurological signs being the major presentation, but also respiratory signs, or even just generalized illness, which is very broad and non-specific. In summary, we want you to be aware that there are global changes bringing the virus closer to our shores. For you as vets, we want you to be aware that this is not just a disease of birds. And while we should have some warning before mammals are affected, we would expect to see illnesses in our pet cats and wildlife that could be presented to you in your clinics, meaning you need to be aware and prepared for high pathogenicity avian influenza in Australia. Thank you.